Early morning at a small regional airport. Sunlight streams through the glass, illuminating a 43-year-old man in a greasy work jacket sitting with his 9-year-old son. The boy watches a sleek aircraft taxi toward the runway. "Dad, do planes really feel different when they take off?" The man smiles. "They do." Nearby, a businessman in a tailored suit snickers to his associate. "Looks like someone who fixes cars, not planes." The man stays silent, focusing on his son. But as the engines roar and the aircraft begins its high-speed roll, the boy looks up. "Dad, that's the one you said you flew before?" Watch them. Jack Lawson was a man who lived in the quiet world of rhythmic metal and honest labor. At 43, his face was a map of focus and weary resilience, etched with the subtle lines of a man who preferred the honest smell of motor oil to the sterile scent of corporate offices. He was the owner of Lawson's small-town auto repair, a tiny two-bay garage where he spent his days bringing aging engines back to life. He wasn't a man of labels or expensive fabrics. He wore simple cotton shirts, scuffed work boots, and usually carried a faint smudge of grease somewhere on his jawline. Jack was a single father. 3 years ago, his world had been hollowed out when his wife Sarah passed away after a brave battle with illness. In the aftermath of that loss, Jack had systematically dismantled his old life to ensure he could be the father Ethan needed. He had moved back to his quiet hometown and taken over his father's old garage. He needed to be the dad who was there for every breakfast, every school play, and every Saturday morning museum trip. He didn't need a high-stakes career anymore. He needed to be a hero in a small house filled with model airplanes. His son, Ethan, was 9 years old and shared his father's observant, technical nature. Ethan didn't just like airplanes. He lived in their flight paths. His bedroom was a gallery of hand-painted wings and star charts. Today was a special reward. Ethan had finished his first semester with top marks in physics, and Jack had promised him a trip to the small regional airfield to watch the takeoffs before visiting the Aviation museum next door. "Dad, look at the flaps," Ethan whispered, pointing a small finger. "They're adjusting for the lift coefficient, right? Just like in the book?" Jack smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Exactly, pal. The plane is feeling out the density of the morning air. It's a delicate balance between weight and will." The airport was small, but it was a hub for high-end private travel. As Jack and Ethan sat in the waiting area, the contrast was jarring. Jack had come straight from the shop after finishing a rush job on a customer's brakes. He was still wearing his heavy canvas work jacket, which bore a dark, fresh oil stain on the sleeve. Ethan clutched a notebook, his eyes wide with the magic of the tarmac. The waiting area was shared with a small group of businessmen waiting for a private charter. They were dressed in charcoal gray suits and silk ties, checking their gold watches with an air of profound impatience. To them, the small terminal was just a temporary inconvenience, and to them, Jack looked like a man who had lost his way into a first-class lounge. "Check the uniform, Frank," one of the men whispered, nodding toward Jack's scuffed boots. "I didn't know the maintenance crew was allowed to sit with the passengers." The other man snickered, adjusting his cufflinks. They saw a garage guy who didn't fit the look of the high-flying world. They didn't see the man who understood the precise aerodynamics of a wing better than the people who designed them. Jack heard the whisper. He felt the weight of their judgmental glares. But he didn't turn around. He didn't defend his dignity. He simply leaned closer to Ethan, pointing at a small propeller plane outside. "Watch the ailerons, pal," Jack whispered, his voice a low, steady rumble. "See how they adjust to the crosswind? That's how the machine talks to the air. If you listen closely, you can hear it breathing." Ethan nodded, absorbing every word. He didn't care about the stains on his dad's jacket. He only cared about the man who knew how things worked. But the men in suits weren't finished. They were about to learn that a person's value isn't measured by the cleanliness of their hands, but by the weight of their history. The atmosphere in the small terminal was a battle between two worlds. On one side, the frantic, high-decibel energy of the corporate elite. On the other, the quiet, analytical focus of a father and son. Ethan was currently sketching the tail assembly of a twin-engine jet parked near the fence. He looked up at Jack, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "Dad, why do some planes have the engines on the wings and some have them on the back?" Doesn't that change the balance when it lifts off? Jack knelt down on the hard floor, ignoring the disapproving look from a passing executive. It changes the center of gravity, pal. If the engines are in the back, the liftoff is more aggressive. It feels like the plane is jumping. If they're on the wings, it's a smoother, more distributed climb. Each one is a different conversation with the physics of the sky. One shouts, the other whispers. Nearby, the group of businessmen paused their talk of quarterly earnings. One of them, a man named Henderson, who was known for his loud voice and his even louder ego, let out a dry, condescending laugh. "Sounds like we have an expert in our midst," Henderson said, his voice dripping with an irony that carried across the entire room. "Listen to the mechanic, Frank. He's explaining the conversations of the sky. Maybe he should give the pilot a few tips before we board. I'm sure his experience with rusted mufflers is very relevant to a jet turbine." His friends chuckled. One of them, adjusting his silk tie, added, "I'll stick to the guys with the licenses, thanks. I prefer my flight data from people who don't have grease under their fingernails. It's safer for the stock price." Jack didn't flinch. He didn't look up to meet their eyes. He had spent years in high-stakes environments where the loudest person was usually the one with the least to say. He simply turned the page in Ethan's notebook. "Ignore the noise, Ethan. Focus on the data. The data doesn't have an ego, and it never needs to boast." But Ethan was sensitive. He felt the sting of the mockery. He looked at his dad's old jacket and then at the polished shoes of the men in front of them. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice small. "Why are they laughing? Did you say something wrong? Do they think you're just a car man?" Jack placed a steady, warm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Sometimes people react to what they see because they haven't learned how to understand. They think the value of a person is found in the price of their suit. But remember what we talked about? Real power is in the things you can do when no one is watching. It's okay. Let them laugh. The truth doesn't need an audience to stay true." "But you really did fly planes before, right?" Ethan asked, his voice gaining a bit of its old excitement. "You weren't just telling me stories to help me sleep?" Jack nodded once, a brief, resolute motion. "I did, Ethan, a long time ago, before the garage, before we moved back home to be near Grandpa's shop. I've touched the edge of the atmosphere, pal. I've seen the curve of the earth." The men in suits overheard the exchange. Henderson's smirk widened into a look of total disbelief. "He flew planes? Sure. And I'm a rocket scientist. Kid, your dad probably flew a lawnmower with a big enough engine attached." "Let's not fill the boy's head with fantasies, pal. It's bad for his education to think a garage is a cockpit." The group laughed again, a shallow, cruel sound that made several other passengers in the lobby look away in embarrassment. Jack stayed silent. He was used to being underestimated. It was his favorite form of camouflage. He knew that the most important takeoff of the day was about to happen right outside that glass window. An announcement came over the speakers. "Attention passengers, the Aerostar prototype is cleared for its final morning certification roll. Please remain behind the yellow line. Should be terminal." The terminal went quiet. Everyone moved toward the glass. Outside, a sleek experimental business jet, the X-100, was taxiing toward the center of the runway. It was a masterpiece of composite materials and high-efficiency turbines. It was the plane that every trade journal had been talking about for months. Ethan's eyes went wide. He pressed his face against the cool glass. "Dad, that's it. That's the one from the magazine. The one you said had the vortex wing design. You said the lift transition on that model was the hardest to master." Jack stood up, his eyes narrowing as he watched the jet's movement. He wasn't looking at the paint or the luxury windows. He was looking at the angle of the elevators and the way the nose gear compressed under the initial throttle. He was listening to the high-pitched whistle of the engines as they moved into the takeoff roll. "Watch the nose, Ethan," Jack said, his voice now devoid of any hesitation. "It's going to lift exactly at the 2,000-foot marker. If the trim is set correctly for the current humidity, it won't wobble. It will just arrive in the sky." Henderson, standing just 3 feet away, rolled his eyes. "Listen to him. He's calling the shot now, betting he's wrong by a mile. Probably thinks he's playing a video game." But the garage guy didn't move. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his greasy jacket, a ghost of a different life reflecting in the glass. The engines roared, a low-frequency thunder that rattled the terminal windows and made the coffee in Henderson's cup ripple. The X-100 began to sprint, and the secret Jack Lawson had been keeping for 3 years was about to lift its nose into the morning light. The roar of the X-100 was a physical force, a vibration that felt like it was humming in Daniel's very bones. As the jet reached the 2,000-foot marker on the concrete, the nose lifted with a surgical, effortless precision. There was no wobble. There was no hesitation. It looked like a bird finally deciding to return home after a long winter. Ethan cheered, jumping up and down. "You were right, Dad. Exactly at the marker. It looked like magic." The businessman stood in a stunned, uncomfortable silence. Henderson checked his watch, then looked back at the sky. He didn't want to admit it, but the mechanic had just called the takeoff more accurately than any flight computer could have predicted. "Lucky guess," Frank muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. One of the terminal managers, a woman named Claire who had been monitoring the flight data on a tablet, walked over to the group. She looked at the data, then up at the jet, and then her eyes landed on Jack Lawson. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her jaw dropped. The tablet in her hand almost slipped. "Captain Lawson?" she asked, her voice hushed with a reverence that made the businessman turn around in shock. Jack gave a small, humble nod. "Hello, Claire. It's been a while. The X-100 looks like she's finally behaving herself. You finally sorted out the fuel flow lag in the secondary injectors?" The group of executives stared. Henderson's face turned a mottled shade of red, the color of a bruised apple. "Captain? You're calling this guy Captain?" Claire turned to Henderson, her expression turning sharp and protective, her voice cutting through his arrogance like a blade. "This guy is Jack Lawson. He was the lead test pilot for the original Aerostar program 10 years ago. He is the person who personally signed off on the flight envelope for every prototype this company has built in the last decade. He's logged more hours in the cockpit of an experimental jet than most of our staff has logged in an office chair." She turned back to Jack, her tone softening into genuine respect. "We thought you disappeared into the mountains, Jack. The industry mourned when you resigned. The board offered you everything to stay. Why did you leave? You were the best strategist and pilot we ever had. No one could read the air like you." Jack looked down at Ethan, who was staring at his father with a look of pure, wide-eyed wonder, as if he were seeing a superhero costume beneath a greasy jacket. "Life changed, Claire. Sarah got sick. I realized that being in the clouds didn't help me when my world was falling apart on the ground. I moved back home to take care of my son and keep my father's legacy alive. The garage, it keeps me grounded, and it keeps me here for him. At the end of the day, I'd rather fix a radiator and make a school lunch than break a sound barrier and miss a bedtime." The truth began to ripple through the terminal like a shockwave. Years ago, Jack Lawson hadn't just been a pilot. He had been a legend, the ghost pilot who could find a logic error in a flight system by the vibration of the seat alone. He was the man who had stayed in the cockpit of a burning prototype for 5 minutes just to relay enough data to save the project before ejecting at the very last second. "You helped design that plane?" Ethan whispered, tugging on Jack's sleeve. "I helped the engineers understand what the wind wanted, Ethan," Jack said softly, kneeling down. "I was just the translator between the metal and the sky." Claire smiled, looking at the scuffed work boots and the oil-stained jacket. "And you're a mechanic now? From Mach 2 to oil changes?" "I fix things, Claire," Jack replied with a faint, peaceful smile. "Machines are honest. They tell you exactly what's wrong if you're patient enough to listen. Whether it's a V8 engine in a pickup or a Mach 2 turbine in a jet, the principles of respect and precision are the same. You just have to respect the metal." The businessmen were no longer laughing. They were trying to look invisible. Henderson stepped back, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a heavy, embarrassing costume. He realized that he had spent the last 20 minutes mocking a man who had more courage and expertise in his pinky finger than Henderson's entire board of directors had in their combined history. I "I apologize, Captain," Henderson stammered, his voice shaky and small. "I had no idea. We shouldn't have assumed. Well, we were out of line." Jack didn't look for a groveling apology. He didn't want their embarrassment. He simply looked at Henderson with a quiet, steady gaze that held more power than a shout. "It's a common mistake, sir. People often use uniforms and labels as a shield because they're afraid of what they don't know. Just remember, the person who fixes your brakes is just as important as the person who flies your plane. We all have a role in the system. The grease doesn't change the brain." Claire invited them to the observation deck for a private tour, but Jack politely declined. "We're actually on our way to the museum. Ethan wants to see the right flyer. He has some questions about the wing warping technique that I think only a physical model can answer." As Jack and Ethan walked toward the exit, the entire terminal watched them in a heavy, respectful silence. The garage guy and the little boy were no longer a smudge on the landscape. They were the architects of the moment. Jack walked with his shoulders back, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. He wasn't the lead test pilot today. He was just a dad. And to him, that was the highest rank he had ever held. The walk to the car was quiet, but the air felt lighter, fresher. The morning mist was starting to burn off, revealing a deep, infinite blue sky that seemed to welcome them. As they reached Jack's old pickup truck, Ethan stopped and looked back at the airfield. He could still see the white contrail of the X-100 cutting a clean white path through the clouds. "Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice full of a new kind of thought. "Yes, pal?" "Why didn't you tell them? When they were laughing at your jacket and your boots? You could have told them you were a captain and made them stop being so mean in 10 seconds. Jack started the truck, the engine responding with a familiar mechanical growl that echoed off the terminal wall. He waited a moment before answering, looking into his son's eyes. "Because being a captain isn't what makes a person worthy of respect, Ethan. If I had to use my title to make them shut up, I would have been acting out of pride. I would have been just as small as they were. I wanted you to see that the truth stays the truth even when people are laughing at it. Character doesn't need a megaphone." He shifted the truck into gear, his movements precise and deliberate. "True skill is like a quiet light, Ethan. It doesn't need to shout to be seen. It just needs to be there when the world goes dark. Those men were loud because they were afraid of being unimportant. They needed the suit to feel real. But a master, a real pro, doesn't care about being important to strangers. They only care about being useful." Ethan thought about this for a long moment, watching the airport fence disappear in the rearview mirror. He looked at his father's hands, the hands that had held a pilot's yoke in a heavy wrench with the same level of care. "I'm glad you're my dad, even if your jacket is greasy. Actually, I like the grease. It means you're doing something real." Jack laughed, a warm, rich sound that filled the cab of the truck. "Me too, pal. Me too. It's the mark of an honest day's work." They spent the rest of the day at the Aviation Museum. For the first time, Jack didn't just read the plaques. He told the stories behind the steel and the rivets. He explained why a specific rivet pattern was used on the bombers of World War II to withstand the pressure of high-altitude runs. He told Ethan about the pilots who flew into storms so that others didn't have to, and the mechanics who stayed up all night in the rain to make sure those pilots had a chance to come home. He was no longer a ghost of his past. He was a teacher of the future. As they walked out of the museum in the late afternoon, they saw a group of university students being led by a tour guide. The guide was pointing at a display of modern jet engines, talking about complexity and genius. "It takes years of elite university study to master these systems," the guide was saying. "You have to be a genius in a lab coat to even touch them. It's a world of pure theory." Ethan looked at his dad and gave him a secret, knowing wink. He realized then that the guide was only half right. You didn't have to be a genius in a suit or a lab. You just had to be someone who was willing to get your hands dirty and listen to the sound of the machine. They drove home through the golden light of the sunset. The city hummed around them, indifferent and fast. But for Jack and Ethan, the world felt perfectly synchronized. The garage guy had proven that real expertise is found in the dirt, the grease, and the quiet moments of fatherhood. The story of the greasy dad at the airport wasn't a story about a hidden legend coming back to life. It was a story about the power of humility. It was a reminder that the people we judge most quickly, the ones who look ordinary or messy, are often the ones holding the world together while we complain about the traffic. Jack Lawson pulled into his driveway, the captain in him at peace, and the father in him triumphant. He didn't need the stripes on his sleeves to know he was flying high. He just needed the small hand in his. Because real respect isn't a destination you reach with a title. It's a foundation you build day by day with integrity and a very good pair of work boots. The sun began to set over the city, painting the skyscrapers in shades of liquid gold and oxidized copper. Jack and Ethan walked back into their small house, the scent of lavender and old books greeting them. The day had been long, but for the first time in 3 years, the silence of the house didn't feel heavy with grief. It felt like a rest well-earned. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, opening his notebook to the drawing of the X-100. He started to add more detail to the wings, his pencil moving with a new, confident rhythm. "Dad?" Ethan asked as Jack started to make dinner, a simple but hearty meal. "Yeah, pal. Do you miss it? The flying? The being a captain that everyone salutes?" Jack paused, looking at the steam rising from the kettle. He thought about the silence of the high altitude, the absolute clarity of the stars when you are above the clouds, and the feeling of the earth falling away. He thought about the adrenaline of the test flight. Then he looked at Ethan, at the boy who was finally smiling again, whose sketches were no longer full of shadows and what-ifs. "I miss the view sometimes," Jack admitted honestly, "but I don't miss the distance. When I was a captain, I was always looking at the horizon miles away. Now, I'm looking at the person right in front of me, and I think this view is a lot more beautiful than anything I saw at 40,000 feet. He walked over and ruffled Ethan's hair. "You know, you were the real hero today, pal." Ethan looked up, surprised, his pencil pausing on the wingtip. "Me? Why? I didn't fly a jet." "Because you saw the truth through the grease," Jack said softly. "You weren't embarrassed of your dad. You were proud of the work I do every day. That takes a lot more courage and a lot more vision than flying a jet through a storm." Ethan smiled, a real, boyish grin that reached his hazel eyes. "I was just telling them what I knew. I knew my dad was the best. And that's the most powerful thing you can do," Jack replied. The next morning, the office at Aerostar was in a state of quiet panic. Claire, the terminal manager, had mentioned seeing Jack Lawson to the CEO. By 10 a.m., Jack's phone was vibrating on his workbench in the garage. It was a call from the board of directors. They wanted him back. They offered him a chief technical officer position. They offered him a 7-figure salary. They offered him the private jet he had just watched take off. Jack listened to the offer in silence. The phone pressed to his ear as he looked at an old engine he was currently fixing. A modest family sedan that belonged to a school teacher down the street. He looked at Ethan's lunchbox on the shelf. "I appreciate the offer, gentlemen," Jack said, his voice calm, steady, and final. "But I'm currently in the middle of a very high-priority engine overhaul. My supervisor is very strict about the schedule, and we have a science project due on Friday. I'm staying right here on the ground." He hung up the phone and picked up his wrench. The city continued its rush outside, but in the small garage on the corner, the rhythm was perfect. Jack Lawson realized then that he wasn't a garage guy or a captain. He was a man who knew the secret to a well-lived life. True respect. It isn't found in the balance of a bank account. It isn't found in the title on a business card or the price of a designer suit. It's found in the peace of mind that comes from knowing you have done the right thing. It's found in the courage to walk away from a world that doesn't align with your soul. And it's found in the laughter of a child who knows their father is always, always there. The planes still flew overhead, their white contrails marking the sky like scars of light. Jack would always look up. He would always listen to the turbines. But as he turned back to the engine in front of him, he knew that the greatest takeoff he had ever participated in was the one where he finally decided to land. He was home. If you believe that real expertise doesn't need to show off, and that a person's value is found in their character, not their clothes, Subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged for how you look, only to prove everyone wrong with who you are?